we have it. Caddy hasn't changed into a blonde. It's the lovely Vicky Nash, who is my sort of, I don't know, a co-conspirator when we worked with Jim Davidson. That's how I met her.
That's a nice way of putting it, Deb.
She's brilliant. She's wonderful. And I love her very much. And I thought she would be a great panelist here on our Wonderbird show because she's very, very smart, unlike the rest of us who are sort of just dumb.
Exactly.
Not very nice lady.
We know we are. We're completely
stupid. So it's so lovely to have you can save us all.
Yes, exactly. I've been watching you, Vicky. You're brilliant, and yes, as Debbie says, very smart.
Very kind. You see, working with Jim, I'm not used to having compliments like this. It's normally just being screamed at, isn't it, Deb? And just, and going, what are you saying? Stop talking, Jim. So this will be very nice and a very different experience, I imagine.
Yes. A very feminine one, which obviously Jim's never done this show. He's too frightened.
I bet he is. He should be.
So he should, yeah. Absolutely.
But he is but Natalie, how are you, Nat?
I'm good. I'm very good.
You look very pink.
I look very pink. Oh,
very
well,
pink.
It's because it's very grey outside, and I just thought it was just cheers you up. A little bit of colour.
Yeah. And pink is 60s, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the 60s. The 60s.
That's right.
Why, is this a segue, dear? Are we going into a segue about the 60s?
We are. We're going into a segue, yes. And today we have Amirreza Tayebi, who's written a book all about the 60s.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Amirreza.
How are you? Very nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. Thank you so much for coming.
A wonderful show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So lovely to have you on the show, darling, in our nest, in our little bird's nest.
I've been looking for it for a very long time. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Amir, I wanted to say that your book, you've written a book about the 60s, and I know that, well, I only just remember the 60s because I was at school, but they say if you remember the 60s, you weren't really there, don't they?
Absolutely. You just pinched my line.
No.
But obviously you weren't there in the 60s, were you?
No, I wasn't there either, but I must have been there in spirit.
Yes, in spirit.
Indeed, yes.
Because
I'm an old soul. So.
You are.
Yeah.
And so obviously you wrote this book on the 60s. What sort of response are you hoping to sort of get from it? Are you hoping, I'm hoping people read this book and go, can we go back to the good old days? Those days.
Absolutely. No, the response has been very positive, actually, because the book, it first got published on the 21st of September. So, and I've had like a few book launches ever since. So, and I've done a few TV interviews as well. So the response has been very positive. And of course, because like now the Swinging 60s, well, this year, it marks the 60th anniversary of the Swinging 60s. And now it's like a whole world away from the current world that we're living in as well. So it's a distraction from the mad world that we're living in at the moment. So yes, people, of course, some people like myself who haven't been there, they're like, oh, we're not that lucky after all. We're not that lucky that we didn't get to see that. But of course, it's still like there are still like we're lucky to have those clips like on YouTube and elsewhere. So. And those films, videos, music, they really transport us back to the 60s still.
Fabulous music.
Yes.
Because Amir, my parents created Wonderbirds, and that went out in 64. And I remember that going up because Lady Penelope, of course, you know, with the pink Rolls Royce, was my mum's creation. And so the 60s was a very big time for my family as well. And Natalie is doing a nod to the 60s with her lovely pink.
Yes, of course, yes.
No, I'm doing a nod to the 60s because I've heard so many stories, because my husband is a little bit older than me and lived very swingingly through the whole of the 60s and has a lot of, well, I think he could write a book. Well, he has written a book, actually. Yeah, some very, very wild stories, the bits that he can remember.
Oh, just like my father. So probably your husband and my late father, they must have crossed paths in those.
Yeah, they probably met at the Bunny Club or something like that. Do you
Yes,
think?
easy ad lib. Where everybody they used to go to ad lib in the basement. It was in the basement.
What where?
Ad lib.
What was ad lib?
Ad lib. There was a club called ad lib, and that's
Oh.
where all of the celebrities of that time they used to hang out there. So you'd be on the dance floor dancing with Michael Caine, Terence Stamp, Julie Christie. Everybody would have gone to the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. Everybody would have gone to ad lib. And
Oh, I thought it was Tramp, but perhaps that was later. That was in the 70s.
Yeah, I think
right.
a bit later.
Tramp was Johnny Gold, because Johnny Gold was the founder of Tramp, and then you also have like Annabelles as well. But those were the private membership clubs, of course. So not everybody were allowed in. So whereas ad lib, speak easy.
Oh, Speakeasy. We can tell you some stories about the Speakeasy, but that was in the 70s.
Absolutely, bag of nails and the Marquee Club. So of course they were all like the integral part of the swinging 60s, and it was really the first time that we had like non-private membership clubs as well, which were free access, which had free access for everybody.
Well, the thing, the Marquee was a gig place. People used to go and play there. And I remember, because my parents were in the music business and they had some of the biggest stars of the 60s. So I mean, even though I couldn't go to the clubs myself, I know where they all went. And I remember one party that they had with some of the people they represented. And I just remember, if you think about it now, there was Cat Stevens, Jimi Hendrix, Scott Walker, who else was in this? All of these people in one room.
Yes, the Walker Brothers, and the Walker Brothers, Engelbert Humperdinck.
Yes, Engelstink Humblebug, as I used to call him.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. And of Tom Jones, and of course some of them, they're still going as strong as ever. For instance, the Rolling Stones last week, they just announced yet another American tour, which is fantastic, which is just great. And they're just ageless. So
I'm not sure we make icons like that anymore.
No, they don't. Well, they don't make them anymore.
They don't, do they?
No, of course not. They really don't make them. And that was the thing about the 60s. It was there was something very magical about that generation of the that like came after the war. So who were born actually during the war. And of course, like to understand the swinging 60s, one has to go back all the way to the 1950s, because well, Britain was still a very much like a food reliant nation at that time, and the youth at that time, they had rather a very austere childhood. And I remember interviewing someone for my book, and he said that the swinging 60s for us, it was as though we were reliving a second childhood, because since we had missed out on our first childhood during the 50s. So that's why we desperately wanted to make up for it. So hence the swinging 60s. So
I remember Carnaby Street, coming into Carnaby Street when I was about 10 or 11, sort of late 60s. And I remember having a bell round my neck, getting a bell. I love this bell. When you think about it now, that a bell, and I had candy striped flares and a bell. And it was like, and there was Carnaby Street, and it was so, Carnaby Street was such, I mean, it was where the 60s were, wasn't it, really?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. Carnaby Street, that's where the mods were. In Carnaby.
Oh, I didn't know if I was a mod or a rocker. I don't think I went through the mods or rockers. I think that was before me.
So we had two. We had two sets during the swinging 60s. We had the Carnaby Street set that you kindly just mentioned, and we had the King Road crowd as well. So those two crowds that were like a bit like competing against one another as well. So we had some bands like the Small Faces, because their offices, their headquarters, they were based on Carnaby Street as well. So they were really the first mod band in British rock history. It was the Small Faces. and then you had like bands like the Rolling Stones. They were more like of like King's Road, like crowd, like hanging out on the King's Road and wandering up and down like King's Road, Sloane Street and Sloane Avenue.
I don't think they were wandering up and down, darling. They would have got absolutely mobbed. My parents used to have an office in Bickenhall Mansions, and they had the biggest bands then. And the kids used to stand outside the door and scream. And so that was from like, I don't know, 67 onwards. Now, I was still at school, but I used to go at work there and sit on reception at the weekends, not the weekends, when I wasn't at boarding school during the time I wasn't at school. But they couldn't have walked down the street. It was very rare you saw them out because they would literally get mobbed.
It's very true. But actually together, yes. But I think individually, like Brian Jones, he used to just hang out at Granny Takes a Trip, which is just down the road from Market. So he used to hang out there with Tara Brown. So Tara Brown, who was the one who got immortalized in the Beatles. I read the news today. Because his life sadly got short by a car accident, a car crash that he had in Redcliffe Square in 1967. So yes, you're right, absolutely right. The Beatles, well, the Beatles, they wouldn't have come to the King's Road. They actually never came to the King's Road. So because they would have got mobbed. And there is a footage of John Lennon talking to David Bailey, and then he told him, actually, he said, I had never been to the King's Road during the swinging 60s because otherwise they would have gone mobbed. And I think the only Rolling Stone who would have been the integral part of the only two Rolling Stones, it was Mick and Brian. And Mick, because there was another aristocrat, dandy, in the style of the swinging 60s called Christopher Gibbs. I don't know if you've heard that name.
No.
Christopher Gibbs, he used to live on Cheney Walk.
Mm-hmm.
And so his place, so he had a big mansion there. And that place, it became like a very iconic place of the face of the swinging 60s. So you had like films such as Blow Up and Performance, actually like getting like shots at his place. So Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull, Nick Rhodes, so all of that crowd, they would have been like his regular guests at his place on Cheney Walk. So it was a very different time, of course. It wasn't like now that celebrities, like they wouldn't be hanging out with like ordinary people or anything as such. And of course, when the 60s started, well, 60 years ago now. So at that time, I remember like, Michael Caine, he once told me, he was like, when we're all like understudy actors at the Royal Court Theatre in Sloane Square, we're nobodies. He was like, I was Maurice Micklewhite. And then there was someone else called David Pinter. And then another one called John Osborne. He was like, and then as the 60s, it carried on, and then we became really celebrities. I became Michael Caine, David Pinter became Harold Pinter, the renowned playwright and the Nobel Prize winner as well. So the 60s, but they weren't like, they never aimed to become celebrities. Whereas nowadays, everybody wants to become an influencer. Everybody wants to become like a celebrity. Whereas in those days, it was just the way that like it happened for them.
Yeah, and it was wonderful to be, to see certain people. If you saw people walking down the street that were big stars, it was like, wow. I mean, really, really, wow, wasn't it, Nat?
Absolutely. Listen, what gave you the idea in the first place? Was it chatting to your dad and listening to this world that he was obviously in?
Yes. Of course, yes. So you're absolutely right. It was really my father, because he was there at that time. He was living between London and San Francisco. So San Francisco was very swinging as well, with Summer of Love and all of that madness that ensued later on. So yes, it was. And then I remember when I was a kid, we used to listen to the Rolling Stones record at all times. Like I remember the first Rolling Stone record actually that I listened to was Out of Time. So
Oh yes.
and it was very interesting because when I last saw them in Hyde Park last year, it was the first time they were playing it live ever. So I was very lucky to hear them playing it live for the first time. So yes, Out of Time, and yes, I really grew up with the sound of the swinging 60s as well. That were part of like they played a major part in my formative years. So for me,
Yeah, I remember, Amir, in the, well, I don't know how old I was, but it was the late 60s. So I was still at school. But I remember a very big TV executive coming to our house for Sunday lunch and him saying, throwing his hands up in despair, because he was obviously very corporate, and saying, oh, I've just seen Donovan, and who was a big sort of star then, and his wife, you know, who was a hippie, and she's like, looks like she's just about to drop a baby. So it's like, it was outrageous in those days, you know what I mean? And she had this long flowing dress on apparently, and they were walking out down the King's Road. And I always remember that as an image from the 60s, because it was like a revolution. Things were happening that really hadn't been accepted until then.
absolutely.
Yeah, and also you didn't know what was going on, not unlike now where everybody knows where everybody is and
Yeah.
everything was happening.
And it
So
wasn't
these guys could keep themselves quite themselves to themselves, really, unless they wanted to be out there.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? They and it's funny because obviously my mum and stepfather used to represent Donovan.
Oh wow.
And Donovan and Linda, that was his wife, and she had a son by Brian Jones from the Stones.
Absolutely.
I know all of this information, you see.
We're
All of
in
it.
60s.
You're better than I do.
I do.
but
I can tell you so much stuff because, you know, having grown up within the industry at that time and my parents representing all of these huge stars at that time. I just knew everybody. I knew everything and everybody, except I wasn't allowed to go to the clubs because I was obviously too young and I never wanted to go anyway. You know, you don't when you're 12 or something. But the others, you know, the 70s is my era of growing up, nightclubs and everything. So it's like the continuation of the 60s, which was quite strange, really, because I think the 60s was so revolutionary, and for me it was magical. And I don't know if that was being a child. I remember one of the things I do remember was when a new record came out. You know, because we didn't always buy it, you used to run to the shop to listen to it, and you used to go into a little booth.
Yeah,
And you used to put. Do you remember that?
yeah.
Headphones, yes.
You'd listen to it 10 times before you decided to go and put your money on the counter.
Yeah.
It's an EP.
Yeah.
It was a little.
Yes.
Yeah. You'd mull up, should I buy the album or should I just buy the EP? But then you think,
Or the
well, if
single.
I really love it, then I'll have to go back and buy the LP. So what do I do? And you'd have this dilemma, wouldn't you? But it would be very expensive to buy the LP.
Yeah, exactly. But you just wanted to, but it was the most exciting thing to hear a new track from the Beatles, or, you know, because you had, especially when you got the LP, because there were songs you'd never heard before. It was really magical, just that sort of music and that time, and also the Beatles, you know, being so in love with Paul McCartney, and, you know, as I was at that time, because he was, you know, they were such idols, and the actors as well at the time, you know, Liz Taylor, all of those people. The women were so beautiful. I remember seeing Twiggy walking down the street in Holland Park, and I remember I'd never seen anyone so beautiful ever in my whole life. But the image of her with these beautiful eyes and this, I don't know, she had a fur coat on or something, but I mean, I, as a child, just looked up at her and thought, oh my God, she's so beautiful.
And I remember actually in the 80s going to a ball. It was a year after I had my daughter, and suddenly I put on loads of weight because, you know, breastfeeding and all that sort of thing. And I was invited by a friend of mine to her brother's 30th birthday party. and I didn't really know what to wear. I couldn't get into any of my clothes. And I turned up at this beautiful hotel because her father owned hotels. And I was sitting next to Twiggy, this is in the 80s, and with me, you know, really not feeling absolutely like a giant. And I looked at Twiggy and I couldn't believe I was next to Twizzy. And then Terence Stamp was sitting opposite me and Peter Firth. And I thought, oh my God, why didn't I put more makeup on?
Trio, surrounded by the trio of
Yes.
Yeah.
Listen, thank you so much for coming on and being our guest. We could talk to you all day about
Thanks,
this.
Amir.
See the book.
So, where can we buy it? Where can we buy it?
Oh, so the book, it's well, it's already been out on Amazon.
Right.
Yes, so on Amazon, and yeah, so it just
And it's available now.
Yes, since 21st of September.
I'm looking forward to reading it and going back into a much nicer time. It must have been so much fun to make.
It's mostly focused on the swinging 60s films as well, because I'm a movie buff. So, of course, I weave in stuff about music, art, and fashion, but it's mostly focused on the swinging 60s films. And I explore behind the scenes of all of those films.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks,
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a great pleasure. I really enjoyed my time on the show.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Wow.
Well, Vicky, what did you make of that then? What year were you born? Frighten us and tell us.
84.
Bloody hell.
Wow. 84?
But
A baby.
My parents always say I was totally born in the wrong era. You know when and people say that all the time. But I'm so I love hearing my parents' stories. I love music from that time. You know what I mean? I just wish, like I said, I wish we could go, but I wish as a society we could go back to that time. Because life is serious at the moment.
It's horribly serious, isn't it? It's horrible.
Yeah.
While we've been chatting, I found a picture, I don't know if you can see that, of my husband dressed in very 60s clothes. Here we go. In Inspector
I can't see Natalie.
You can't see. I've also got a picture of him with Peter Straker. I don't know if you can see that one.
Wow.
Kissing him.
Wow.
That's Clive. He was so gorgeous then, wasn't he?
He still is.
Yeah, he still is, darling. But I mean, I remember him being, really, it's sort of like he was very iconic in the 60s, your husband.
Yes, very handsome.
Well, I don't know about iconic. Probably had a rather, his reputation, probably. I wasn't born.
Preceded him.
Thank you, Vicky, for being a wonderful panelist. We're going to see you for a few shows here and there, which is lovely.
You're lovely, thank you.
Even though you're only born in 1984. I've never heard of anything.
I know.
You got to live through a much better time.
I don't think so. I think the thing is that you're still gorgeous, and we still, we love you, even though you're the youngest ever Wonderbird.
Yes. Am I really? Well, that's an honour. Thank you, lady.
Yeah,
thank you.
Anyway, we will be back soon, and we'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.